Welcome back to the Faith Informing Podcast. I'm Travis Jameson, and I'm your host. The conversation about men and masculinity is everywhere right now, and most of it generates more heat than light. On one side, voices insisting that real men are warriors, that strength is the point, and that the culture has gone soft. On the other, the insistence that masculinity itself is the problem. My guest today thinks both of those answers are wrong, and that the church has something different and better to offer. Zachary Wagner is a New Testament scholar. He's an ordained minister and the author of the newly released Men of Virtue, How the Fruit of the Spirit Forms Male Character in the Modern World. Zach holds a D.Phil in New Testament Studies from Oxford. He serves currently as Director of Programs at the Center for Pastor Theologians, and is the author of a previous book, Non-Toxic Masculinity. And we're so happy to have him on the show. Zach, thanks for being here.
Travis, it's great to be here and to connect again. You and I actually go back about a decade or more. Is that right? Our paths
even
overlapped. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we were back at Moody Bible Institute.
Right. Of course, we were at Moody before we were at Calvary together. So
yes,
amazing.
Yeah, I still remember our senior, I forget what it was called, senior seminar or something for theology majors.
Yes.
And I still remember you and there was like 3 students in the class. You were one of them. And I thought, dang it, these kids are smart. Like they are really thinking deeply. So you were one of the ones I was like, wow, this is impressive. And it was great. It was such a great atmosphere to learn in. It was really pushed me. I really enjoyed that time. And then we were.
Am I remembering right? Did I have any class overlap with your wife Annie as well? Does that sound familiar? Were the 3 of us in any classes together back then?
I don't know if the 3 of us were, but she said, I was telling her about this, and she said, you guys were in a group internship at Calvary.
Okay,
Memorial.
maybe that's the context that I'm thinking about. Man, ancient history. This is like 2013, 2012.
Yeah, exactly. 2012.
Yikes, that's wild.
And it feels weird to say that was a long time ago because
it was. We're getting up there, Travis.
I know, it's just insane. Well, I'm grateful to have you on to talk about this Men of Virtue book. I've been following you along throughout the years with you doing your writing, and read your first book and was really excited about this next book. So love to just have a conversation about it. Why this book? What is it specifically that you are addressing? And why do you feel like now is the time? Like, because you had a lot of other things going on in your life, like working on your doctorate at Oxford. Most people would have been like, that's enough because I don't have time for anything else. But you were like, no, this book needs to be read or needs to be written. So I'd love to just hear about like, what prompted this?
Yeah, I mean, could come at this from a few angles. My first book, the subtitle of Non-Toxic Masculinity is Recovering Healthy Male Sexuality. And that book was something like, 30% memoir in the sense that it was prompted by a lot of what I was seeing in the cultural conversation about men, sexual violence, this conversation around purity culture, which was really kind of peaking right around 2020 and after and a little bit before as well. And that was intersecting with my own life and my own story in ways that kind of led to me doing some processing and some writing, and then the opportunity to write that book. So there was a very kind of like personal edge to why I wrote that first book. And in the months immediately following that book's release, got a lot of, really meaningful feedback from folks as they were reading that book. And one of the things I heard from people was, hey, this is great, but it is like, it promises more than it delivers in the title, in the sense that the title is Non-Toxic Masculinity. And this is a book mostly about sex and dating and marriage and, pornography and sexual abuse and things like that. Kind of in that sexual erotic lane of male experience. And some people were like, I was looking for something like a little bit more like, what is godly masculinity, full stop. So I had a sense of like, there was more to be said even after I wrote that first book. But like I said, I was very busy. Like you said, rather, I was very busy, and I also was wary of being kind of like pigeonholed as the like Christian masculinity guy.
Yeah.
I'm still nervous about that, to be honest. But
The I kissed dating goodbye of the 2020s.
yes.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, if only how many copies of I Kissed Dating Goodbye?
Oh man,
did
it'd be
Josh
flying
sell?
off the shelf.
Yeah. But yeah, all joking aside, I did not really have. I thought maybe I'd write more books. It was a process that I enjoyed. I loved connecting with readers. And here's another thing I'll say, and this actually connects to my doctoral research. It's something my supervisor, I heard him say, and I've kind of like absorbed into my brain in the way I think about this. I write not to say what I think, but to figure out what I think, which is to say, like, the process of researching, writing, getting your thoughts down on paper, drafting chapters for a book project is, hopefully you go into that process really curious about something, having an idea of where you want to go, but open to where the process of writing is going to take you. And I'll say I came at both of these projects with a lot of curiosity, a lot of wanting to figure out what is a healthy way to think about and talk about this. So, but to go back to the kind of personal story, and I'll get to the cultural conversation as well, because, you know, in the first book I released in 2023, and at the time, folks might have thought like this is kind of like the high watermark of all this conversation about masculinity and male violence, and, you know, the cultural polarization, shall we say, around men and masculinity, and that turned out not to be the case. I think President Trump was reelected in 2024, and one of the kind of headlines after that was the unique role that male voters, that men, had played in his candidacy both times, but certainly the second time around in a really pronounced way. And around this time, kind of as all this was happening, an editor at Brazos Press, Caitlin Beatty, reached out to me and said, hey, have you know, she kind of headhunted me. Like, what are you thinking about next? Are you thinking about writing more? Is there anything you'd be interested to do with Brazos? And I said, sure, but not on masculinity. I'll tell you that much. But she's like, I really think you should think about doing more on this topic. And in the back and forth, she managed to convince me to jump back in. And this is something I talk about in the acknowledgments for Men of Virtue. Briefly, but there was, in that dialogue I had with Caitlin, an idea emerged that really excited me and piqued that curiosity and gave me the energy I think I needed to jump back into this topic, which was namely, what would it look like to do a book on what it means to be a godly man that's built around the fruits of the Spirit? This kind of one of the most famous definitions, summary definitions of godliness that we have in the entire New Testament. And it's not gendered in Galatians chapter 5, but it seems to me, and I actually ended the first book here, like a non-toxic vision of what it means to be a godly man would be a man characterized by love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And Caitlin was really excited about that idea, and I got excited about it too when I was thinking through what would it look like to do a book on that.
It's really helpful to just hear a little bit of the background
and
see why you came back to this, because I do, when I read your first book, it did, even to me, I think at the time, I thought a follow-up would make a lot of sense to go deeper, or looking back now, it makes sense. And especially around the fruit of the Spirit. I think, you know, there's so many books on what it means to be a godly man. And the fact that yours is novel because it is focused on the fruit of the Spirit is, honestly, if you just take a sec, that seems really strange, because the fruit of the Spirit is the pathway of the Christian life, according to the Spirit. So it makes sense. But so why do you think the fruit of the Spirit hasn't been the main focus in this conversation before? I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole approach to the Bible that is kind of wanting to take our modern questions and superimpose them on the biblical text. Like this question of, well, what does it mean to be a godly man? As opposed to, or I think in at least in distinction from what it means to be a godly woman. We
Hmm.
have a lot of conversation in our culture around gender roles and what is the unique calling of men and what is the unique calling of women. And certainly the church and the kind of evangelical church that you and I were reared in had quite a lot of thoughts, a lot to say about these ideas of gender roles.
Hmm.
But I think particularly for men, the New Testament data is actually kind of limited. We'll have entire discipleship programs in our churches around, the disciplines of a godly man and what is the role of a man and leading your home and leading your wife, quote unquote, and a lot of this language. But it's telling to me that Jesus doesn't talk about this actually at all. Like there's no instruction from Jesus on manliness and masculinity. It's not like he has a discipleship program for his guys on how to kind of graduate from beta status to alpha status of being a male. Rather, the exhortations are to godliness, a godliness that both men and women alike are called to. But this is the essence of what it means to be a godly man is to be godly as a man.
Mm.
And this is what I felt was missing from the conversation. And I think also explains why a lot of what's out there is kind of, in my view, baptized cultural stereotypes with kind of proof texty Bible verses attached to it. You go to the Bible with a ready-made idea of what it means to be a man, and then you kind of look for the verses that support that idea. Rather than and in that sense, we approach the Bible where the first question is, well, what does it mean to be manly? And does the Bible affirm manliness? And I'm kind of trying to come at it from a different angle and asking, what does it mean for men to be godly? And that's a different conversation. And I think this is not a kind of tirade against the feminists or the woke liberals or even in a sense like the MAGA Republicans or anything like that. It's a what is the moral exhortation to believers for what it looks like to grow in Christ's likeness, to grow into the virtues of godly excellence is what I talk about early in the book, and then applying that to male identity in the modern world. What does it mean to follow Christ in a male body in that sense? What are the implications of my maleness for my pursuit of godliness? How is something like the fruit of the Spirit refracted through male embodiment in a way that is not utterly unique, but perhaps is distinct from some of the ways it might be refracted through female embodiment? So that's what I'm trying to do in the book, and I think gets to your question about how it's maybe a little different from some of what else is out there.
Yeah, I really appreciated from the beginning of this book. Like, I was so happy to see how nuanced you are throughout your writing. Like, you're constantly kind of doing this back and forth of like, yeah, there's the liberal side, there's the mega side, and the temptation is to get pulled into those. And I think at one point you talk about the ditch on either side of the road, which is a perfect illustration for that, a perfect analogy, because it's like, yeah, the ditches want to pull you off the road, but you really do a good job of trying to bring us readers along on the path of like what actually is being said in scripture about what it means to be a man. And I appreciated that you were like, actually, specifically about being a man is a very limited amount of the Bible. And I just so that just naming that is like, okay. But I also appreciate that because it's such an issue in culture about what it means to be a man. I appreciate that you're taking that seriously and you're saying, look, the Bible doesn't actually answer those questions directly always, but there is other ways to use the Bible to answer those questions. And I thought you were really doing that. And so you open the book by arguing that men and boys are in in a real crisis. Like you acknowledge that, you say that's
Yeah.
real, and then you trace it through these three historical revolutions, like industrial, sexual, and technological.
Mm-hmm.
Why does that history matter for understanding what's happening to men right now?
Yeah. Yeah. What I argue is that the Industrial Revolution and the sexual revolution, and then the kind of ongoing, we're in the middle of it, technological revolution, have created real disruptions to male identity. And by disruption, there's not a value judgment. It's not good or bad, but it is disruptive. Well, maybe I should say it's not all good or all bad, but it is disruptive. So if you were to rewind the clock kind of 150 years ago in our culture, the on the surface contributions, unique contributions of male embodiment, specifically that men are, 15 larger, stronger, and faster than women, need less sleep on average overall, demonstrate more kind of risk taking and ambition, things like that are associated with maleness and male identity. Those had a real kind of cash value in the world before machines and automation and industrialization outsourced a lot of that strength of male bodies in particular to non-human machines, but not autonomous machines like we have today, which is further disruption. So that was kind of part one. So the meaning and the value of male embodiment was more obvious and apparent back in this pre-industrial age. And then the sexual revolution, which again is a mixed bag. It's a lot of, I think, genuinely unjust cultural structures and assumptions were kind of brought to the surface, as well as stereotypical assumptions about what men ought to do and what women can't or ought to do. But invention of things like the birth control pill that I think folks would have hoped would have led to a drop in out-of-wedlock births have actually led to the opposite, a massive rise in out-of-wedlock births, and particularly for this conversation, in fatherlessness and in boys growing up, particularly in poorer communities and communities of color, boys growing up without a father or a father figure at home. And what we see in the data is that when a father is absent in the home, it is the boys that suffer the worst effects of that and have the worst. The girls, it's not like all girls do fine, but girls tend to do better without, in overall life outcomes, having not had a father at home than boys do on average. There's higher incidence of, substance abuse and depression and joblessness and low academic achievement and jail time and suicide. Like, all of this is associated with fatherlessness, which is directly downstream from the sexual revolution. And then today, is something, a kind of simple anecdote I use in the book. If it's 1875 and you need someone to go chop down a tree, you're probably going to have a man do it because a man is going to be better at doing it on average. But today we use machines to cut down our trees. And like lots of times, a woman's just as good at using a machine and as a man is. So the unique contribution of maleness is not as apparent. And more of the kind of productive work in our society is technology based. Like, what is manly about sending an email? Nothing really in particular. There's no kind of unique value that my male body brings to that task. And that is true of more and more and more every year of the labor and the work that's done in our economy. And these are real disruptions for male identity. And the kind of downstream effect of this, I argue, is this like fourfold crisis. Just to list them, crisis of education, crisis of fatherlessness that I've already alluded to, crisis of meaning. We've seen a massive rise in male depression and joblessness, as well as loneliness. And the culmination of it really is these so-called deaths of despair, which are deaths due to suicide or accidents or overdose. And we've seen a massive rise in those among men of all ages, but kind of young men in this like 18 to 35 bracket in particular. And then the last is a crisis of character, where there's a kind of lost vision about what are the virtues of manliness, what are the virtues associated with male excellence, if we can use that language, and a loss of vision or even seeing as valuable something like a uniquely Christian vision of virtue, something like the fruits of the Spirit. So that ties in then to the point of the book, in the sense that I think a way we can address these disruptions is to reorient ourselves back to a uniquely Christian vision of virtue, not a pagan vision of virtue, but a Christian one, and help boys and men derive meaning from this remaking of the world that we are called to partner with God in, and then cultivating in themselves the character that prepares them, suits them, cultivates a readiness to partner with God in the work of the gospel and the remaking of the world according to the lordship of Christ. So that's what I'm kind of trying to do there. And that's me kind of in brief trying to connect those dots of that history and what I'm doing in the book with the virtues and the fruits of the Spirit.
Yeah, I really appreciate in the book when you talk about instead of talking about like what does it mean to be more manly, you call us to focus on growing up into a more mature, virtuous expression of maleness or male character. So it's like man up versus grow up. And yes. I think for many guys, at least a lot of guys I know, we all have heard the phrase man up. And we've also probably heard the phrase grow up. But I really appreciate this distinction that it's about maturity rather than like as an individual, as in your character, rather than a focus on like, I gotta be a man, like whatever that means. Do you think you could give us like a concrete picture of what that difference looks like in a real man's life? Because you offer lots of stories throughout your book. And so I'd love to just hear like, what's that look like? Man up versus grow up.
Yeah. So when I hear the phrase man up, and I want to kind of, it's not all bad in the sense that I think a call to man up in its best version is a call towards maturity. It's a exhortation, say, to a boy or a young man who is acting in a way that is immature. And you're calling them to a greater sense of responsibility, a greater sense of faithfulness, a greater sense of self-mastery or contribution to their community or their family or whatever the case may be. I think that's a good version of that. But there's also perhaps less good versions of this, where we see a young man perhaps expressing some level of emotional sensitivity or something like that. And man up then becomes stop acting so girly and conform to this stereotype of manliness that our culture has kind of determined you ought to, or you are seen as less valuable as a man. Well, or perhaps your interests don't align with the cultural stereotypes of your community, or so you can see a man up, a version of man up that is invitational, that is inviting a young man into a more mature and virtuous expression of their, God-given maleness. Sure. But there's also, I think, plenty of versions that are, instead of inviting someone into greater Christ-like maturity in a church context, are instead almost bullying and shoving someone towards a culturally situated stereotype of manliness, a performative version of manliness that's more about outward appearances and cultural performance than it is true maturity and Christ likeness. Yeah, so that's kind of the difference that I see there. If you don't like football or shooting guns or something like that, to use just a couple silly examples, from a Christian perspective, I'm like, who cares? Who cares? Not that there's anything wrong necessarily. I don't know. Like maybe someone wants to make that argument. I'm not here to kind of make that claim with liking manly things. And I think there's something really beautiful to the kind of way men gather around shared interests and bond over those things. This is, I think, in its healthiest expression, this is what's really beautiful about team sports for men, is the way that there's a kind of male fellowship and bonding around a shared activity or a shared interest. But you can also see the way that those kind of bonded communities can become exclusionary and can become ways of alienating and ostracizing those who don't conform to that or don't find interest in that. And that's the balance I'm trying to strike here. Like if you don't like football from a Christian perspective, who cares? If shooting guns makes you uncomfortable, well, Jesus told us not to live by the sword, so that seems fine to me. And particularly if you don't like guns because you have, Christian convictions around violence and nonviolence, well, good on you. That seems like it's you living according to your conscience, contrary to the standards of manliness in your culture that may be pressuring to conform you into the world and its mold. Romans chapter 12, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So if someone has a Christian conviction towards pacifism, I want to affirm the direction that your conscience is bringing you to, guided by the Holy Spirit, and not say, well, that's not very manly of you. Man up. Sometimes men need to fight. And it's like, well, you could have said that to Jesus in the garden, and he would have had some things to say to you in response. So long answer, but that's some of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And I think it gets after one of the distinctions you do make in your book, is that there's a difference between how the brokenness of masculinity has happened in regards to individual responsibility and more of like the systemic issues. And there seems to be like this, I think you put it like there's like the small s sin of individual moral failure and the capital S sin of principalities and powers. And they're both at play in the broken masculinity that we see all around us. And I appreciated that nuance and that way of talking about it, because it really clarifies that like there's more at play here about what it means to be a man, and that everyone has grown up in certain environments that are affecting their view of manhood. Do you have any advice for maybe pastors or ministry leaders or people who are just ministering to young men? How would, keeping that big S sin and little s sin in mind, how would you approach these conversations around masculinity? What's the posture, I guess?
Yeah. So I'll bring in a couple things from the book. You alluded to the ditches before.
Yeah.
I have a chapter called the twin ditches of cultural masculinity in this moment. And this is, I think, a polarization, like so many things in this cultural moment, where we're being pushed by our algorithms or our media environment or just the people we're around towards two extremes. And the extremes on the one hand, and this is very much a lot of the media environment that young men in particular are pushed towards in the quote unquote manosphere. And this is everybody from Jordan Peterson to Joe Rogan to Andrew Tate to Clavicular now is the new kind of look maxer guy on the radar that everyone's talking about. That tends to lean towards a kind of doubling down and indulging in your natural masculine urges. If it's manly, it's good, lean into that. So there's a ditch of indulgence on the one hand, and I think you can associate that. Again, this is the kind of right-leaning ditch of the ideological right. This is a kind of chest-bumping, performative over-celebration of manliness and masculinity, where the virtue formation is less of a value. If it's manly, it's good. And then on the opposite extreme, I think you have folks, and this is the more kind of left-leaning ditch, which wants to perhaps de-emphasize the differences between men and women and just say, well, can't we all just be good people? Or in a Christian perspective even? Can't we all just be godly? Why are we so obsessed with these differences between men and women? And to that, and I will say this goes even farther than that, to the denigration of men, this conversation around quote unquote toxic masculinity, where you kind of view anything uniquely or distinctly male as like a scourge on society. So I actually think the principalities and power, that capital S sin, we can see at work here to kind of push us into either unhealthy ditch, a ditch of indulgence in our kind of masculine urges as we understand them. And you can see like a leaning into kind of dominance and bravado and hypersexuality or lust on this side, and then a hatred of men or of even yourself as a man and whatever you associate with your masculinity, including like if I notice myself feeling competitive, I'm like, oh, gross, like why am I like that? Or if I notice myself having sexual desires, like, oh, this is my evil manliness coming up again. And the way of Christ, I think, in Christian theology and the biblical story in particular, actually equips us to push back on both of these errors. And I think pastors, so many boys and young men just need the affirmation that they're good. Your maleness is good. It is a good thing to be male. Your male body is a gift, something that God looks at and delights in. And you have value not in spite of your maleness, but because of it. There's something unique that you contribute that God made you for and delights in. And just this cultural swirl around toxic masculinity and men are trash and all of this kind of mainstream left-leaning media rhetoric is, I think, really damaging and alienating to men, genuinely. And what it does is it then pushes them towards the other extreme of this kind of hyper-performative bravado. Like you say men are toxic, I'm just going to be even, you say masculinity is toxic, I'm just going to masculinity even harder.
Yeah.
This kind of like immature, alienated reaction, because these are the spaces where men feel like they're actually finding some sort of affirmation and community, and they hear that there's goodness, and maybe people are tapping into that feeling of alienation and loneliness and grievance against the people on the other side of the ideological spectrum. So it's good. Maleness is good. It's a good thing to be a man. The male bodies are good bodies. But the New Testament says repeatedly we need to put to death the works of the flesh. There's a cultivation of virtue, a godly way to live in that body, and the truly human way of living in the world modeled by Jesus is not centered on power. It's not centered on worldly or physical strength. It redefines what strength is. It's strength refracted through weakness. It's not lording it over others. It's serving others. So a Christian vision of masculinity is not about hierarchy or authority over others. Rather, it's about how do I use whatever gifts and strength God has given me to love and serve others. So there's an others orientation rather than this kind of like mere self-actualization. How can I get the best job and the most power and the most influence and the most attractive spouse and the best worldly possessions? That's not what Christian masculinity is about. It's something that rejects all of that in pursuit of a genuine, individualized cultivation of that character of God as seen and refracted through Jesus and empowered by the Spirit. But man,
Great.
In terms of that kind of principalities and powers and the individual side, and against the principalities and powers, we can speak back to that and say men are good, actually. Like their masculinity and maleness is not toxic, full stop. And as Christians, we can't say that. We need to affirm the goodness of men and manliness on some level. But there's a character cultivation that we are also called to kind of balance out the other extreme as well.
Yeah, I love that. So we don't have too much longer together, so I just want to focus in on the fruit of the Spirit at the end. If there's one fruit of the Spirit, I mean, we could obviously spent 9 episodes going through all the fruit of the spirit. But if you just
Mhm.
want to share, what's one that's God is laying on your heart, like that's burdening you for men, like
Mm-mm.
which virtue stands out to you as like, okay, if you want to read one chapter of my book, just read this one right now.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, well, in one sense, the chief virtue in the list is love, and love comes first. And this, God is love in John 1, or First John rather. And greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, faith, hope, and love remain, but the greatest of these is love. I talk about why love is at the front and why love is at the center of a Christian vision of virtue. But as you were kind of framing up that question, I think gentleness is really important here, and particularly for how we think about Christian masculinity. Jesus, so the word for gentleness is prautes, the Greek word there. And it's related to a couple things that Jesus says in Matthew's gospel. The first is in the Beatitudes when he says, blessed are the meek, the prautes, for they shall inherit the earth. And later when he describes himself, he says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I, self-description, Jesus describing himself, I am gentle, praus, and lowly of heart. So this character trait of not kind of dominant, violent, hyper-assertive use of strength, but a genuine meekness and gentleness and humility, I think is really valuable as a character trait for men. And something I cite someone else who talks about the virtue of gentleness, and she says that the more power you have, the more important it is that you have this virtue of gentleness. And again, just kind of looking to the generalized differences between men and women. This isn't true across the board, but broad strokes is very much true that men are larger, stronger, and faster than women. Again, so in this kind of raw physical strength, men start well ahead of the curve of women. And I talk about this in one of my chapters on gentleness, multiple chapters on gentleness. I talk about the power to the power to serve and the power to help versus the power to harm, and how gentleness is kind of the mediating virtue that means you can be helpful rather than harmful in your use of power. The way this kind of shakes out in my parenting, I'll say, is I have 2 daughters and I have 1 son. And, all kids need to be told to not be violent when they're upset and like to not hit each other. And when, I need to tell my daughters that as well as my son. But there's a certain edge to it that I give, or maybe just a different nuance or angle that I give when I'm talking to my son about it, because he's going to grow up to be a man with a stronger body than many of the, I'm 6'3". He's probably going to be fairly tall as well. And there's a responsibility that he has to be gentle when he is an adult, because he can, in a sense, if he doesn't grow in that virtue, do more damage if he fails to be gentle in his life and relationships. He also has a potential to really love and serve others with that embodied strength and advantage, if you will. So, man, gentleness seems so important to teach men and boys and cultivate in them precisely because of these physical differences and advantages. And it's also something I need to cultivate in myself as the father in the home, the a largest body around, I suppose. When I lose my temper a little bit and shout, my kids have a different reaction to that than when my wife loses her temper, because I'm just scarier when I get upset. And when I do that, I often use this. If I need to apologize to my kids for that, I'll say, Daddy wasn't gentle with my voice when I was talking to you about that. And I need to always be gentle. Jesus teaches me that I need to be gentle. I'm trying to listen to the Holy Spirit teaching me to be gentle. And in this instance, I wasn't as gentle as I should have been. So kind of, that's a way that I use that language of these virtues in ways that are kind of particular to my maleness. I'm taking my maleness and I'm taking my son's maleness and refracting it through this virtue of gentleness. And I think that's one of, if not the most important one for men to be thinking about as they look at the fruit of the Spirit.
I really love that story of apologizing to your children, because I think it exemplifies the work that is needed as men. Like, that this task of becoming virtuous men is not easy. Like, it's not easy actually in the moment to humble yourself to the point where you can apologize to a 4-year-old. It actually, that doesn't come naturally. Most men, I don't think most fathers are like, yeah, it's no problem, I can just say sorry to my kids and explain it and be open, because there has to be this self-awareness. You have to really know yourself and what's going on and what your aim is in life and what you're working towards and who you want to become. And without that work, it's very hard to communicate that to the little ones in our lives. And I totally relate to that story with my little kids, is this sense of even saying something as simple as, you know what, that was probably confusing for you, that I would raise my voice like that. And that must have been scary, like, because Dad doesn't normally talk like that. It's like, and having those kind of conversations with our kids is absolutely vital. But like that, I think I really like this point about gentleness, that it's like the power we hold, which everyone holds some kind of power in different relationships. And then as a man in a family, you hold a particular power. And how do we use that power in ways that are marked by gentleness? And I think I can't help but think that the end result is the empowerment of other people. Like, it will always lead to lifting others up in the process. And I think that part of your work is really shows me that this isn't just about individual development, like self-development, like becoming the best version of myself. It's truly going to foster communities of shalom, communities of love, communities where everyone in that space gets to thrive. And I think that's a really just powerful, powerful view of masculinity, where it's yes, I got to work on myself, and by doing so, it actually helps the whole community. It's a great call. Well, Zach, we are out of time for today. This has been a really rich conversation. I can tell you're just passionate about this, and I'm excited for your book. And it's a reminder, Men of Virtue, How the Fruit of the Spirit Forms Male Character in the Modern World. Zach, if people want to learn more from you, follow you, where can they find you?
Yeah, so the social media platform that I'm most active on these days is Substack. And so you can find me over at Substack. I think my handle there is just Zachary Wagner. I also do Instagram a little bit. I'm about 98% of the way there of just completely shutting down my Twitter X. I think it's about time.
Is the Manosphere taking over Twitter? Has it fully taken it over at this point?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
There's a certain vibe over there.
I think Grok is the epitome of that.
Yes. Yeah. But yeah, I'd say Substack, Instagram, I'm on those places. I also have a personal website, zacharycwagner.com, where folks can contact me. So that's the place to go.
All right. That's awesome. Well, Zach, thank you again. Thanks for being on Faith Informing.
Yeah, great to be here and catch up. And I really enjoyed the conversation.